Okay, so we thank you so much for watching Law School Made Easy at Law School Made Easy 256. Today I want to go to the case of Woolmington versus DPP. This is a case every first year student of law will come across, and you have to discuss this case because it's a locus classicus when it comes to burden of proof. Now, burden of proof, this is in criminal proceedings, that where we have a criminal proceeding, a criminal offense has been done. So the burden now lies on prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt. That prosecution must prove, the burden lies on prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt. So what are we saying? We are saying that we want to establish, when they say the burden lies on prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt, what do they mean? Where did we get this analogy that the burden lies on prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt? And the standard is beyond reasonable doubt. Now, we have a case of Woolmington versus DPP. Now, this is a case which is a locus classicus. This is a case which actually started the idea that the burden lies on prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt. We shall dig straight into this case. Now, when we go to the case of Woolmington versus DPP, and now this man had separated with his wife. Now, while he was at work, he felt that he missed his wife and he wanted his wife so much. So, what he did, Woolmington, he got a gun and said, "Let me go." And I threatened her that if she doesn't come back to me, I'm going to kill myself. So, Woolmington, while he was at work, he stood up, went to the girl's family. Now, when he reached in the girl's home, Woolmington met the mother of the girl outside and asked her, "How are you, in-law? Mother-in-law, how are you? Well, I've come to see my wife. Where is she?" So the mother was like, "Go inside. She is inside." Now, when Woolmington entered inside, he started to plead for his wife to come back to him. So he pleaded, telling her, "If you don't come back to me, I am going to kill myself." He had tied a gun in his neck. Now, accidentally, he triggered the gun and shot a woman, and the woman died. So those are the brief facts of the case. So the woman has died, and now we go to the court of first instance, the trial court. Now, when we reach trial court, that court decided that Woolmington had failed to prove. He failed to prove his case. Therefore, Woolmington was convicted. Now, the court of first instance discussed and stated that Woolmington failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt, that he failed to prove court that he did not intend to kill the woman. And the court has stated that the burden lies on the person who has committed the offense. That when you commit the offense, you must prove to court that yes, I did not commit this offense intentionally, or it was by accident, and all those scenarios. Now, Woolmington was therefore arrested and convicted. Now, while in custody, Woolmington decided to appeal the decision of the trial court. Now, when Woolmington appealed the decision, now the House of Lords sat and established what we call the golden thread principle, and that is the burden of proof. The House of Lords discussed and said that the burden lies on the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt that because Woolmington had pleaded in the defense of accident, that he did not intend to kill, that was enough. Now, prosecution must now prove beyond reasonable doubt that the death of Woolmington, his wife, was actually not intentional. Now, prosecution has to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The burden was now established. Now, this case literally established the principle that burden of proof lies on the prosecution, and they must prove the standard is beyond reasonable doubt. Now, students to use this case tend to use this case to explain what we mean by burden of proof. You cannot use the case of Woolmington versus DPP to establish what burden of proof is, simply because this is the case that established the principle. Now, when you're discussing the point of burden of proof, you must now begin to give other cases where the principle which was established, which we call the golden thread principle, which was established, how has how have courts now applied. So after giving the locus classicus of Woolmington versus DPP, you now turn to other cases where prosecution has either proved beyond reasonable doubt or has failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt. But not here. The moment prosecution fails to prove beyond reasonable doubt, it literally means that that person is going to be acquitted. But if prosecution is able to prove beyond reasonable doubt, then that person is going to be convicted. I'll give you examples of two cases where prosecution failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt. They failed to apply the principle that we got in Woolmington versus DPP. Let's take a case of Uganda versus Dr. Agwechinji, now the late. Now, in the case of Dr. Agwechinji, he was accused that he had killed his wife. Now, because he was accused, he pleaded in the defense of alibi. He said, I was not in the place where my wife was killed from at that material time. And now the burden now shifted to prosecution to place Chiinji at the scene of crime, which they actually failed to place him at the scene of crime, and eventually Chiinji was acquitted. So let's now take another case of Uganda versus Kasolo, Kopriano, and others. Now, in the case of Uganda versus Kasolo, Kopriano, and others, prosecution proved that Kasolo and the team had participated in the killing of the victim of the deceased. So because prosecution proved beyond reasonable doubt, the Casolan team were convicted and they were sentenced up to, as we speak right now, they are the waters in Luzira serving their sentence of over 100 years and so and plus. So that is the case of Woolmington versus DPP. Why did I bring in these other cases? That students tend to use this case to explain what burden of proof means, and then they think they have answered the question. You only use it to show that this is a case which established the principle, which we call the golden thread principle, which we call the burden of proof, and now you give other cases where the principle was applied. So we want to thank you so much for watching Law School Made Easy at Law School Made Easy 256. Subscribe, share, and always like our videos. Thank you so much. Very grateful.